The year was 1850, and Alabama was still wild, a place where cotton fields stretched endlessly under the southern sun and whispers of old superstitions lingered in the shadows of plantation homes. The Ellison family lived in one such house, a grand yet decaying estate surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow light whole. It was here where the legend began, though no one dared speak of it openly. On the morning of her 16th birthday, Eleanor Ellison woke to find the house eerily silent. Her mother had always been strict about birthdays, filling the day with laughter and celebration, but this time something was different. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Eleanor dressed quietly, slipping into the hallway where the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. She paused outside her younger sister Clara's room, listening for any sign of movement, but heard nothing. Pushing the door open, she found the bed neatly made, the room empty. "Clara?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No answer came. By midday, the household was in chaos. Servants scoured the grounds, searching every corner of the property, while her father paced the parlor, his face pale with worry. Eleanor's mother sat motionless in a chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, muttering prayers under her breath. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, it became clear that Clara had vanished without a trace. Weeks passed, and the search yielded nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no clues to suggest where Clara might have gone. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their voices low and fearful. Some blamed runaway slaves, others spoke of wolves or bandits, but deep down everyone knew this was something else entirely. Eleanor tried to move on, forcing herself to focus on chores and lessons, but the absence of her sister loomed over her like a storm cloud. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howling through the trees outside. And then, one evening, she saw it. The first sign that something was terribly wrong. She had been brushing her hair in front of the vanity mirror, when a flicker of movement caught her eye. Turning quickly, she scanned the room but found it empty. When she looked back at the mirror, however, she froze. Reflected behind her shoulder stood Clara, her face pale and hollow-eyed, her lips moving. Soundlessly, Eleanor spun around, her heart pounding, but the room remained empty. Returning to the mirror, she stared at her own reflection, searching for any trace of her sister. But Clara was gone. That night, the whispers began. At first they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves outside her window. But soon they grew louder, forming words that slithered into her mind like snakes. "Find me, save me. It's not safe here." Eleanor clutched her pillow, trying to block out the sound, but the voices only grew more insistent, weaving themselves into her dreams until she couldn't tell where reality ended and nightmares began. Her parents noticed the change in her, of course. They couldn't ignore the dark circles under her eyes or the way she jumped at every creak in the house. Her mother urged her to pray, seeking solace in religion, while her father dismissed it as grief-induced hysteria. But Eleanor knew better. Whatever had taken Clara wasn't done. Not yet. One afternoon, while exploring the attic, Eleanor stumbled upon an old trunk covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside, she found a collection of items belonging to her grandmother, a woman she had never met, but whose name was spoken in hushed tones around the house. Among the relics was a journal bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle with age. Flipping through it cautiously, Eleanor discovered entries detailing strange occurrences during her grandmother's youth. Visions of shadowy figures appearing in mirrors, children disappearing without explanation, and warnings from townsfolk about a curse. Tied to the Ellison bloodline, the final entry stopped her cold. "Every daughter vanishes on her 16th birthday. Mark my words, it will happen again." Eleanor's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her mind racing. Was this why Clara had disappeared? Was it some twisted fate passed down through generations? Before she could process further, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, pulling her attention away. Rushing down the stairs, she found her mother standing frozen in the parlor, her face white as chalk. On the floor lay a porcelain doll, its head cracked and smeared with dirt. It was hers, her mother whispered hoarsely. Clara's. Eleanor stared at the doll, her stomach churning as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just a random disappearance. It was part of something far older and darker than anyone had realized, and if the pattern held true, she would be next. The doll lay on the floor, its cracked porcelain face staring blankly up at Eleanor. Its once delicate features were smeared with dirt, as though it had been dragged through the earth itself. Eleanor knelt beside it, her fingers hovering hesitantly over its broken head. She didn't want to touch it. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, like it carried a piece of whatever had taken Clara. Her mother remained frozen in the doorway, her hands pressed tightly against her chest as though trying to hold herself together. "Where did you find it?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "I didn't," her mother replied, her tone hollow and distant. "It was here when I came into the room." Eleanor frowned, glancing around the parlor. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn tight against the encroaching dusk. There was no way the doll could have appeared without someone bringing it inside, and yet there it was, lying in the center of the floor like an accusation. Before she could question further, her mother turned abruptly and hurried out of the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the unsettling artifact. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing against the doll's cold surface. A jolt of unease shot through her, sharp and electric, and she quickly pulled her hand back. The whispers returned almost immediately, soft and insistent, seeping into her ears like smoke. "She left it for you." A warning. Tick-tock. Eleanor shuddered, rising to her feet. The house seemed quieter than usual, or perhaps it was just her imagination, but the silence pressed against her ears like cotton wool, muffling every sound except the voices in her head. That night, sleep eluded her completely. Every time she closed her eyes, images flooded her mind. Clara standing at the edge of the woods, her expression hollow and pleading, shadowy figures moving silently through the trees, and always the doll, its cracked face leering at her from the darkness. Finally, unable to endure the torment any longer, Eleanor slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the attic. The journal she had found earlier called to her, its pages filled with secrets she couldn't ignore. If her grandmother had known about the disappearances, then maybe she had also known how to stop them. The attic was colder than before, the air thick with dampness and decay. Moonlight streamed through cracks in the roof, casting jagged shadows. Across the cluttered space, Eleanor moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by layers of dust, until she reached the trunk where she had found the journal. Kneeling beside it, she opened the lid and began sifting through its contents again. Beneath the journal lay a bundle, wrapped in yellowed cloth tied with fraying ribbon. Carefully, she untied the knot and unfolded the fabric, revealing a collection of objects: a silver locket engraved with intricate patterns, a small mirror, tarnished with age, and a lock of hair bound with thread. As she picked up the locket, it snapped open unexpectedly, releasing a faint scent of lavender. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to Clara, and to Eleanor herself. Written on the back in spidery handwriting were two words: "Save her." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. This wasn't just her grandmother's story, it was hers too. Whatever curse had claimed Clara was reaching back through generations, binding them all together in a cycle they couldn't escape. But before she could process further, the attic door creaked open behind her. Turning slowly, Eleanor saw her father standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. His face was unreadable, his expression somewhere between anger and despair. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice low and strained. I needed answers," Eleanor stammered, clutching the locket tightly. "About Clara, about what happened to her." Her father stepped forward, his movements deliberate and slow. When he reached her, he knelt beside the trunk, his gaze sweeping over its contents. For a moment, he said nothing, simply staring at the objects, as though seeing them for the first time. Then finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't be digging into this," he said quietly, his tone laced with warning. "Some things are better left buried." "But why?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising despite her attempt to stay calm. "Why? Won't anyone tell me the truth? What happened to Clara, and what's going to happen to me?" Her father flinched visibly, his shoulders tensing beneath his shirt. He looked away, his jaw tightening as though struggling to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It started long before your grandmother," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "Long before anyone in this family even set foot in Alabama. It's a curse, a debt we inherited from our ancestors. Every daughter vanishes on her 16th birthday because that's the price we pay for surviving." Eleanor stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Surviving what?" she asked, her voice cracking under the strain. Her father hesitated, his expression torn between guilt and resignation. "The land," he replied finally. "This plantation, it's built on blood. Native graves, desecrated slaves worked to death crops grown from stolen lives, and when the spirits demanded payment, we gave them ours instead." The revelation hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. Her family's wealth, their legacy, it was all built on suffering, on lives taken without remorse. And now, she realized with growing dread, it was her turn to pay the price. Her father must have seen the fear in her eyes because he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll protect you," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "Whatever it takes, I won't let them take you too." But even as he spoke, Eleanor knew his promise was empty. No one could protect her, not from something so ancient, so relentless. By the time she returned to her room, the whispers had grown louder, overlapping voices speaking in frantic tones. "You can't run. It's your turn now." The clock is ticking. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the locket tightly as tears streamed down her face. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but deep down she knew it wouldn't change anything. The curse was real, and it was coming for her, and then she saw it, the figure standing in the corner of her room. At first glance it looked like Clara, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences. Her sister's face was paler, her eyes darker, almost black, and her lips curled into a faint smile that sent chills down Eleanor's spine. "They're waiting for you," Clara whispered, her voice layered with countless others grating against Eleanor's sanity. "Who?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. "The ones who took me," Clara replied softly, "and soon they'll come for you too." Before Eleanor could respond, the figure dissolved, into smoke seeping into the cracks in the walls until it vanished entirely. The whispers followed soon after, fading into silence once more. When Eleanor woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the room in golden hues. For a brief moment, she thought it had all been a dream. The whispers, the visions, the cursed locket. But when she looked down at her hands, she saw the photograph still clutched tightly in her grip. Her stomach churned as she realized something was different. The mansion no longer felt empty. Soft sounds drifted through the hall's, distant laughter mingling with faint cries. Footsteps echoed overhead, moving deliberately, as though someone, or something, was walking the same paths she had explored. The night before, Eleanor rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. She needed answers, and she knew where to start. The woods. Descending into the dense forest surrounding the estate felt like stepping into another world entirely. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth, and decay tinged with something metallic, blood. At the center of the woods stood a clearing dominated by an ancient oak tree, its branches twisted unnaturally toward the sky. Beneath it rested a stone altar stained black with age. Candles flickered weakly around it, their flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the ground like living things. And then Eleanor saw them, the figures emerging from the trees. They were children, dozens of them, their faces pale and translucent, their eyes wide with sorrow. They reached out toward her, their hands pressing against an invisible barrier, as though begging for release. "You promised us safety," one of them whispered, her voice breaking mid-sentence. "But you lied. I'm not responsible," Eleanor stammered, backing away until her spine hit the altar. "But you are," another voice replied, layered over the first. "You carry their blood. You carry their guilt." Before Eleanor could respond, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundation of the clearing. From the shadows emerged a figure, indistinct, shifting constantly between shapes, a man, a woman, a child, then nothing at all. Its face was featureless, smooth and white like porcelain, yet it radiated an aura of malice so potent it made the air taste bitter. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice layered with countless others, grating against Eleanor's ears like nails on slate. "No more running," it continued, tilting its head as though studying her. "You've inherited their curse. You'll finish what they started." With that it lunged, dissolving into smoke that surged forward, engulfing her completely. Pain exploded in her chest, sharp and searing, as images flooded her mind. Flashes of memories that weren't hers, yet somehow intimately familiar. She saw herself standing beside her ancestors, cutting deals in candlelit rooms, exchanging innocence for power. She saw herself dragging children into the woods, their cries muffled by the thick trees, and she saw herself chanting alongside them, invoking entities whose names defied pronunciation. When the vision subsided, Eleanor found herself collapsed, on the ground, gasping for air. The figure reformed several feet away, watching her with an expression of cruel satisfaction. "You already know the truth," it whispered softly. "Now you must decide what to do with it." And with that, it vanished, leaving Eleanor alone in the clearing, the weight of the past settling over her like a shroud. Eleanor lay on the cold forest floor, her chest heaving as the remnants of the vision clawed at the edges of her mind. The faces she had seen, the terror in their eyes, the words chanted beneath the ancient oak, they felt real, visceral, as though they were etched into her very soul. Yet she knew those memories weren't hers, not directly anyway, but if not hers, then whose? The whispers returned, softer now but insistent, weaving themselves into the silence like threads stitching together fragments of a forgotten past. They spoke her name over and over, each syllable dripping with longing and sorrow. "Eleanor." She clenched her fists, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, filling the clearing until it seemed to echo inside her skull. Then abruptly, it stopped, leaving behind an oppressive stillness that made her skin crawl. Slowly, she rose to her feet, brushing dirt and leaves from her dress. Her gaze fell on the stone altar at the center of the clearing, its surface stained, black with age. Something about it drew her closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. As she approached, the air grew colder frost, spreading across the ground beneath her feet. The candles flickered erratically, their flames casting jagged shadows that danced unnaturally along the trees. On the altar rested a book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle, Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew instinctively that this was the source, the nexus where the curse began and ended. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and opened the book. The text was written in a language she didn't recognize, guttural and sharp, yet somehow familiar, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Each page was filled with intricate diagrams of rituals involving blood sacrifice chants, invoking entities whose names defied pronunciation, and warnings scrawled in the margins about the consequences of failure. But one section stood out marked with a ribbon tied loosely around the spine. The title read, "The Ritual of Binding." Below it, detailed instructions described how to bind the spirits of the land, trading innocence for protection and prosperity. But there was a catch. The ritual required renewal every generation passed, down through the bloodline, until the debt was paid in full. Eleanor's stomach churned as the realization hit her. This wasn't just her ancestors' burden anymore. It was hers. Summoning every ounce of courage, Eleanor began to read aloud, her voice trembling as she recited the incantation written in the book. The words felt foreign on her tongue, sharp and grating, yet strangely empowering, as though they unlocked something deep within her. Each syllable echoed unnaturally in the clearing, reverberating off the trees and filling the air with an oppressive energy. As she spoke, the symbols carved into the altar began to glow their light, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Shadows writhed across the clearing, taking on shapes that resembled human figures before dissolving into smoke. The temperature plummeted, frost spreading across the altar and the surrounding ground. Then suddenly the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundation of the woods. From the darkness emerged figures, dozens of them, their forms translucent and shimmering like heat rising off pavement. Children, their faces were pale, their eyes wide with sorrow, but their expressions radiated anger and betrayal. "You promised us safety," one of them said, stepping forward. Her voice was layered with countless others grating against Eleanor's sanity. "But you betrayed us. I'm not responsible for what happened." Eleanor shouted, her voice cracking under the strain. "I didn't make the deal. I didn't hurt anyone." "But you're here," another child replied in his accusatory tone. "You carry their blood. You carry their guilt." Before Eleanor could respond, the children surged forward, their forms dissolving into smoke that engulfed her completely. Pain exploded in her chest, sharp and searing, as images flooded her mind once again. This time, however, the visions were clearer and more visceral. She saw herself standing beside her ancestors, not as a bystander, but as an active participant. Her hands were stained with blood, holding the same knife used in the sacrifices. She watched herself dragging children into the woods, their cries muffled by the thick trees, and she saw herself chanting alongside her family, invoking entities whose names defied pronunciation. "No," Eleanor gasped, stumbling backward until her spine hit the altar. "That's not me, it can't be." "It is you," Clara's voice whispered, emerging from the shadows. She stood several feet away, her expression unreadable. "You think you're innocent because you weren't there when it began. But the curse doesn't care about time or place. It feeds on family lines, on blood." Eleanor sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the weight of the truth crushed her. She wasn't just the inheritor of her ancestors' legacy, she was its continuation. When the visions finally subsided, Eleanor found herself lying on the cold forest floor, gasping for air. The children had vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers and the echo of their laughter. Clara remained watching her with an expression that bordered on pity. "There's still time to fix this," Clara said softly, her voice tinged with both regret and resolve. "Finish the ritual, admit what you've done or what you represent. Break the cycle." Eleanor hesitated, her mind reeling. Could she do it? Could she stand in front of these ghosts, all the victims of her family's curse, and confess to crimes she hadn't committed but was nonetheless tied to. Taking a shuddering breath, she rose to her feet, clutching the book tightly. "Fine," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Let's finish this." The final step of the ritual required her to stand at the center of the clearing directly in front of the altar and speak the confession aloud. As she moved into position, the symbols carved into the altar glowed brighter, their light pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. The air grew colder frost, spreading across the ground like icy veins. Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. Then slowly and deliberately she began to speak. "I am Eleanor Ellison," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the clearing, "and I carry the guilt of my ancestors. Through their actions and mine, I have caused pain and suffering beyond measure. I offer this confession as proof of my remorse. Release those who are trapped. Break the cycle." For a moment, nothing happened. The clearing remained silent, save for the faint crackle of candle flames. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The symbols erupted into blinding light, flooding the clearing with an intensity that forced Eleanor to shield her eyes. The whispers returned louder now, overlapping voices speaking. In frantic tones, "It's working, they're free," but at what cost? As the light faded, Eleanor opened her eyes to find the clearing transformed. The candles had extinguished themselves, plunging the space into darkness. The symbols carved into the altar had vanished entirely, leaving behind smooth, unblemished stone. But something else had changed. Clara stood before her, her expression softer now, almost peaceful. "You've done it," she said quietly. "The curse is broken. The debt is paid." Before Eleanor could respond, Clara dissolved into smoke, seeping into the cracks in the ground until she vanished entirely. When Eleanor stepped back into the mansion, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The air smelled clean for the first time since she'd arrived, carrying none of the decay or metallic tang she had grown accustomed to. Footsteps no longer echoed through empty rooms, and the shadows remained static, clinging to corners like normal darkness. The house was finally silent. But as Eleanor prepared to leave, she noticed something strange. The photograph of the young girl, the one she had found in the locket, was clutched tightly in her hand. Its surface was cracked and the image faded almost entirely. Yet when she turned it over, new writing appeared on the back, scrawled in ink so fresh it looked wet. "The debt is never truly paid." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as the realization hit her. Breaking the curse hadn't erased it, it had merely passed the burden on to someone else. Sometime later, another descendant would inherit the legacy of the Ellison family, and when that day came, the cycle would begin anew. The photograph burned in Eleanor's hand, its edges curling slightly as though the paper itself recoiled from the words scrawled on the back. She stared at them, her mind struggling to process their meaning. The debt is never truly paid. What did it mean? Hadn't she done everything required? Broken the cycle, freed the trapped souls, confessed the sins of her bloodline? But deep down, she knew the truth. Some debts couldn't be erased. They could only be passed on, like a shadow cast by an unyielding sun. The curse wasn't gone. It had merely shifted, waiting for its next victim. And until that moment came, Eleanor was left with the aftermath, a hollow emptiness that gnawed at her relentlessly. Stepping inside the mansion felt surreal. The grand yet decaying estate loomed around her, silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. For the first time since she'd been old enough to understand, it looked like what it truly was, a relic of the past, swallowed by ivy and time. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, biding its time until the next chapter of its story unfolded. She climbed the stairs to her room, gripping the banister tightly as each step creaked beneath her weight. When she reached the landing, she paused, glancing at the mirror hanging on the wall. Reflected in its tarnished surface was not just her own face, but something else, something faint and indistinct, lingering behind her shoulder. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned around, scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. But the corridor was empty, the shadows clinging to the corners like normal darkness. Returning her gaze to the mirror, she saw nothing unusual this time. Just her own reflection staring back at her, pale and wide-eyed. Shaking her head, she muttered under her breath, "It's over. It has to be." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time had become slippery. Again, but Eleanor couldn't settle. Sleep eluded her, plagued by dreams of children reaching out to her from shadows, their voices pleading for help. During the day, she wandered aimlessly through the house, unable to focus on anything but the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. Its presence was a constant reminder of the burden she now carried, a weight far heavier than any physical object should have been. And then there were the whispers. They started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a faint murmur in the background. When she was alone, easily dismissed as the hum of electricity or the wind brushing against the windows. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, overlapping voices speaking in fragments that formed sentences too disjointed to make sense of. "You think you're free? It's not over. Find us." Eleanor tried to ignore them, telling herself it was stress or exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But the whispers weren't just external, they came from within, resonating in her bones like a tuning fork struck too hard. It was as if the land itself had infected her, embedding itself in her very soul. One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, she sat at her desk and spread out the contents of the journal she'd salvaged from the attic. Each page was a labyrinth of guilt and despair, detailing her ancestors' descent into madness as they struggled to maintain control over the bargain they'd made. But hidden among the entries were clues, cryptic references to locations and rituals that hinted at something larger, something older than even the Ellison family curse. Her eyes landed on a name repeated throughout the text, always accompanied by dates decades apart: Black Hollow. It was mentioned sparingly, often in passing, but each reference carried an undertone of dread. Black Hollow wasn't just a place, it was a nexus, a convergence point, where the veil between worlds thinned enough for entities older than time to seep through. According to the journal, it was here that the first deal had been struck, sacrificing innocence to secure power and protection for her family. But the final entry stopped her cold. If the cycle is broken, the debt will seek another vessel. Find Black Hollow and destroy the altar, or risk unleashing something worse than death. Eleanor's stomach churned as the realization hit her. Breaking the curse hadn't ended it. It had merely delayed the inevitable. Whatever entity her ancestors had bargained with, it wasn't bound by human notions of time or consequence. It would come for her eventually, seeking payment in full, and unless she acted quickly, others would suffer because of her failure. The journey to Black Hollow took her farther than she'd anticipated, deeper into the wilderness than any map dared to chart. The roads became narrower, winding through dense forests, shrouded in perpetual twilight. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, tinged with something metallic: blood. When she finally arrived, the sight before her sent a chill down her spine. Black Hollow was a crater-like depression, surrounded by jagged cliffs, its floor littered with stones carved with symbols identical to those she'd seen in the clearing beneath the ancient oak. At the center stood an altar, ancient and weathered, its surface stained black with age. Candles flickered weakly around it. their flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the ground like living things. As Eleanor approached, the whispers returned, louder now, forming a deafening chorus that pressed against her ears like, "Cotton wool, you've come to finish it, or continue it. Choose wisely." Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, clutching a shard of obsidian she'd taken from the woods, the same fragment she had used to break the ritual in the clearing. The journal had instructed her to destroy the altar using an object tied to the cursed soul, in this case the shard, and recite a chant meant to sever the connection between worlds permanently. But as she raised the obsidian above the altar, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Clara. This figure was indistinct, shifting constantly between shapes, a man, a woman, a child, then nothing at all. Its face was featureless, smooth and white like porcelain, yet it radiated an aura of malice so potent it made the air taste bitter. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice layered with countless others, grating against Eleanor's sanity. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm ending this." Without hesitation, she brought the shard down onto the altar, striking it dead center. The glass shattered instantly, shards exploding outward in every direction. A blinding flash of light engulfed the clearing, followed by a deafening crack. Like thunder, when the light faded, the altar was gone, replaced by a scorched patch of earth. The whispers ceased entirely, leaving behind an eerie silence that stretched endlessly. But as Eleanor turned to leave, she noticed something strange. The shard of obsidian lay at her feet, unbroken, and on its surface, etched into the stone like acid, were 3 words: "The debt remains." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as the realization hit her. Destroying the altar hadn't ended the curse, it had merely scattered it, spreading the burden wider and thinner across the world. And now, wherever she went, the debt would follow. By the time Eleanor returned home, the mansion felt different, or perhaps it was just her. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an unsettling emptiness that echoed through the halls. Her parents avoided her gaze, their expressions unreadable, as though they sensed that something fundamental had changed. But Eleanor couldn't bring herself to explain. How could she tell them that breaking the curse hadn't freed them, that it had only delayed the inevitable, that someday another daughter would vanish on her 16th birthday and the cycle would begin anew? Instead, she retreated to her room, closing the door behind her and sitting on the edge of her bed. In her hand, she held the photograph, its cracked surface reflecting the dim light from her lantern. On the back, the words remained clear. "The debt is never truly paid." Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. She wasn't free, not really. The curse had fractured, splintered into countless pieces that would embed themselves in others, waiting for new vessels to carry the burden. And Eleanor, whether she liked it or not, was still tied to it. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. The words etched on its back, "The debt is never truly paid," seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though mocking her attempts to escape the curse that had haunted her family for generations. She stared at them until her vision blurred, her mind racing through fragments of memories and visions she couldn't fully comprehend. She wanted to believe it was over, that destroying the altar in Black Hollow had severed the connection between the living and the dead, breaking the cycle once and for all. But deep down she knew better. Some debts couldn't be erased, they could only be transformed. The curse wasn't gone, it had fractured, splintered into countless pieces that would embed themselves in others, waiting for new vessels to carry the burden. And Eleanor, whether she liked it or not, was still tied to it. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and hollow mornings. Eleanor wandered through the mansion like a ghost, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the warped floorboards. The house felt quieter than before, or maybe it was just her. But the silence pressed against her ears like a void. Her parents avoided her, retreating into their routines as though nothing had changed. They spoke rarely, their voices strained when they did, as if they too sensed the fragile peace that now hung over the estate. But Eleanor couldn't bring herself to confront them. How could she explain what she had done or failed to do? How could she tell them that breaking the curse hadn't freed them, that it had only delayed the inevitable? Instead, she buried herself in the journal, searching for answers hidden among its brittle pages. Each entry was a labyrinth of guilt and despair, detailing her ancestors' descent into madness as they struggled to maintain control over the bargain they'd made. But one phrase repeated multiple times, always accompanied by dates decades apart, caught her attention: "Find the keeper." At first, Eleanor dismissed it as nonsense, a desperate plea from women losing their grip on reality. But the more she read, the clearer it became. The keeper wasn't a person, it was a role, a title bestowed upon someone tasked with maintaining balance between worlds, someone who could guide her, to help her understand what needed to be done. And so, armed with nothing but the journal, the shard of obsidian, and a growing sense of purpose, Eleanor set out once again. Her journey took her farther than she'd anticipated, deeper into forgotten places than any map dared to chart. Abandoned towns swallowed by forests, churches buried beneath layers of ivy, caves etched with symbols older than language itself. Each location carried traces of the curse, echoes of pain and suffering, left behind by those who had inherited fragments of the debt. But none held the answers she sought. Until, finally, she found herself standing before a cabin nestled deep within the woods. Its walls were warped by time and neglect, its roof sagging under the weight of secrets long buried. Yet something about it felt familiar, as though she'd been here before, in another life. Inside, seated at a small wooden table, was an old man. His face was lined with age, his eyes clouded with cataracts, yet there was something piercing about his gaze, as though he could see straight through Eleanor to the truth beneath. "You've come far," the man said softly, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "But you're not ready." "I don't have a choice," Eleanor replied, her tone firm despite the storm raging inside her. "If I don't stop this, others will suffer because of my failure." The man nodded slowly, gesturing for Eleanor to sit. "Then listen carefully," he said, leaning forward. "The debt isn't a curse. It's a balance, a reminder that every action has consequences. You can't destroy it, but you can manage it. Carry it forward, teach others to do the same, and perhaps someday—" He trailed off, his expression unreadable. "Someday what?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking under the strain. "Someday, the debt will find peace." When Eleanor left the cabin hours later, the shard of obsidian rested securely in her pocket, its surface smooth and unbroken. The words etched into it had faded, replaced by a faint glow that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. The old man's parting words echoed in her mind: "You are the keeper now." As she walked away, disappearing into the trees, Eleanor realized something important. The curse hadn't ended, it had merely changed. Instead of being a victim, she was now its guardian, tasked with ensuring that no one else suffered because of it. And while the weight of that responsibility would always linger, haunting her like a shadow cast by an unyielding sun, it also gave her purpose. For the first time since inheriting the Ellison legacy, Eleanor felt whole. Returning to the mansion, Eleanor found her parents waiting for her in the parlor. Their expressions were unreadable, their eyes fixed on her as though trying to decipher some hidden truth. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching endlessly like a chasm between them. Finally, her father broke the tension. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "I went looking for answers," Eleanor replied, her tone steady despite the storm raging inside her. "And I found them." Her mother flinched visibly, her hands clutching tightly at the fabric of her dress. "What kind of answers?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The kind we should have known all along," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "This curse, it's not just ours. It belongs to everyone who has ever lived on this land, everyone who has ever benefited from what was taken." Her father's jaw tightened, his shoulders tensing beneath his shirt. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "I'm saying we can't run from it anymore," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "We can't pretend it doesn't exist. If we want to break the cycle, if we want to protect future generations, we have to acknowledge the truth, and we have to make amends." Her parents exchanged a glance, their expressions torn between guilt and resignation. For a moment it seemed as though they might argue, but then her mother lowered her gaze, nodding silently. Over the weeks that followed, Eleanor worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of her family's sins. She scoured records and archives, piecing together stories of lives lost and lands stolen. She reached out to descendants of those who had been displaced, offering what little restitution she could. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. As the months passed, the whispers grew quieter, fading into the background. Like distant echoes, the shadows that had once writhed unnaturally along the walls now remained static, clinging to corners like normal darkness. But Eleanor knew the debt hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted, spreading its burden wider and thinner across the world, and wherever she went, it followed. One evening, as Eleanor stood in the clearing beneath the ancient oak, she noticed something strange, reflected faintly. In the glass of the tarnished mirror she had brought with her were two figures standing where no one should have been. Children, their faces pale, their eyes wide with sorrow. And this time, they weren't pointing at something unseen. They were pointing at her. The reflection in the tarnished mirror froze Eleanor's blood. Two children stood behind her, their translucent forms shimmering faintly as though caught between worlds. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with sorrow, but this time they weren't pleading or accusing. They were pointing directly at her, their small hands trembling as they gestured toward her chest. Eleanor turned sharply, scanning the clearing for any sign of movement, but the space around her was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the children remained, their expressions unchanged. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of despair. One of them opened their mouth, and though no sound emerged, Eleanor heard their words echo inside her mind. "You carry it now." Before she could respond, the figures dissolved into smoke, seeping into the cracks in the ground, until they vanished entirely. The mirror's surface rippled like water, then went still, reflecting only her own face staring back at her, pale, hollow-eyed, and burdened by a truth too heavy to bear. Eleanor sank to her knees, clutching the shard of obsidian tightly in her hand. Its faint glow pulsed rhythmically, as though it shared the same heartbeat that now echoed through her veins. She had thought destroying the altar would end the curse, but instead it had transformed her into its vessel, a keeper tasked with carrying the debt forward indefinitely. But why? Why had the curse chosen her? Was it because of her bloodline, her actions, or simply fate's cruel design? As these questions swirled in her mind, fragments of the journal's final entries came rushing back to her. The old man in the cabin had said something crucial before she left, something she hadn't fully understood at the time. The debt isn't a curse, it's a balance. A balance, not a punishment but a reminder, a tether binding the living to the sins of the past, ensuring that those who benefited from stolen lives never forgot the cost. And now, Eleanor realized, she wasn't just a victim of the curse, she was its embodiment. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor threw herself into her role as the keeper. She traveled across Alabama, seeking out descendants of those displaced by her ancestors' greed. Some welcomed her efforts, grateful for acknowledgement, even if it came centuries too late. Others rejected her outright, their anger palpable as they slammed doors in her face. Each encounter left its mark on her, chipping away at the fragile peace she had fought so hard to achieve. But even as exhaustion threatened to consume her, she pressed on, driven by a sense of duty she couldn't ignore. Yet no matter how far she wandered, the whispers followed. They grew quieter over time, fading into the background like distant echoes, but they never disappeared entirely. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, they would surge back with renewed intensity, reminding her of the debt she carried, and the lives lost because of it. One night, while staying in a small inn near the outskirts of Montgomery, Eleanor dreamed of the clearing beneath the ancient oak. The air was cold, frost spreading across the ground as candles flickered erratically around. The stone altar, standing at its center, was Clara, her expression softer now, almost peaceful. "You've done well," Clara said, her voice layered with countless others, yet somehow gentle. "But your work isn't finished." "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Eleanor admitted, tears streaming down her face. "It feels like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders." Clara stepped closer, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Others will come after you, keepers who will take up the mantle, when you can no longer bear it. But until then you must endure, for their sake and for ours." Before Eleanor could respond, Clara dissolved into smoke, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers. When she woke, the shard of obsidian lay beside her on the bedside table, its faint glow steady and unwavering. Months passed, and Eleanor returned to the mansion one final time. The house felt different now, lighter, as though the shadows that had once clung to its walls had finally lifted. Her parents greeted her warmly, their expressions filled with gratitude and pride. "You've changed," her mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you've been doing, but thank you." Eleanor nodded, unable to find the words to explain everything she had endured. Instead, she focused on the present, cherishing the fleeting moments of peace she had earned. But as she stood in the parlor, gazing at the faded photograph of the young girl, the one she had found in the locket, she knew the debt would never truly leave her. On the back of the photograph, the words remained clear: "The debt is never truly paid." Years later, Eleanor sat on the porch of the mansion, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her hair had turned silver, her hands lined with age, but her eyes still burned with purpose. Beside her sat a young woman, her niece Amelia, the next in line to inherit the Ellison legacy. "Do you understand what I'm asking of you?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Amelia nodded slowly, clutching the shard of obsidian tightly in her hand. "I'll carry it forward," she replied, her tone firm, "for as long as it takes." Eleanor smiled faintly, placing a hand on Amelia's shoulder. "Then the debt will find peace, at least for a little while." As the two women sat together, the whispers returned, soft and insistent, weaving themselves into the silence like threads, stitching together fragments of a forgotten past. Tick-tock. The clock is ticking. Find us. And somewhere, deep within the woods, beneath the ancient oak, the stone altar began to glow faintly once more. The end.